It's my greatest pleasure to welcome you at the Center for Advanced Studies at LMU Munich and to the lecture of Professor Gisèle Sapiro. My name is Julia Schreiner. I'm one of the academic coordinators here at the center, and I'm responsible for humanities and social sciences. First of all, I would of course like to thank you, Professor Sapiro, for coming to Munich and to accepting our invitation to give this lecture today. Furthermore, I thank Professor Carlos Spoerhase, who will introduce Professor Sapiro in a minute. Carlos Spoerhase is spokesperson of the CAS Research Focus, SCALES. The research focus brings together researchers from history, literature, theater studies, and art history. And we are very happy to welcome several members of the research focus and the co-speaker of the group, Dr. Sina Steklich. She's an historian dealing with global history. And we are, as I mentioned before, very pleased that Gisèle Sapiro accepted our invitation to give the opening keynote lecture of this research project. Here at CAS, we are looking forward to the activities of the research focus that will take place at CAS during the next 2 years. For example, there will be a workshop on the scales of digital humanities in the next summer semester, and Lisa Rigazzoni will be a visiting fellow at CAS. And to keep it very briefly, I would like to draw your attention to our current exhibition. We are very excited and happy that the Franz Marc Museum is presenting the famous portfolio Jazz by Henri Matisse here at the center. Henri Matisse created the art collection in 1947, and you will find the art pieces belonging to this jazz folio downstairs. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to hand over to Carlos Spoerhase.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. It's really with great pleasure that I welcome you, Gisèle Sapiro, Professor Sapiro, to the Center of Advanced Study at LMU Munich. As some of you might know, Professor Sapiro is a distinguished scholar and a leading voice in the sociology of intellectuals, literature, and cultural production. She's currently Director of Research at the CNRS and Professor of Sociology at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. And her really impressive academic journey included studies in comparative literature and philosophy at Tel Aviv University, followed by studies in sociology at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. And since her studies, her work has been met with widespread acclaim, including numerous prizes, visiting professorships and fellowships at prestigious institutions such as UC Berkeley, Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, and Princeton University. And this year she was awarded the prestigious Humboldt-Forschungspreis, recognizing her significant contributions to the field. Professor Sapiro's research explores the fascinating dynamics of the intellectual and cultural fields, tracing the intricate pathways through which works and ideas migrate across borders. She works within a Bourdieusian framework to illuminate the social and cultural forces shaping the production, circulation, and reception of literature, intellectual works, and artworks. Her prolific scholarship has had a profound impact on the field, and her work has been widely translated, making her research accessible to a really global audience. Among her recent English publications, you'll find the illuminating Sociology of Literature, published by Stanford University Press, and the Routledge Handbook of the History and Sociology of Ideas, both from 2023. And Professor Sapiro also recently published the monograph, this one here, Qu'est-ce qu'un auteur mondial, le champ littéraire transnational, a masterful synthesis of her research on the emergence of a global literary field. A wide-ranging and path-breaking work that will be translated into English, and I think you have already mentioned translations in four more other languages, to Bengali, for example. So beyond her academic contributions, and I think this is also very important, Professor Sapiro is also a prominent public intellectual, engaging in critical cultural questions in French media. She's always had a generous approach to this and has always shared her scientific expertise with wider audiences in newspaper articles and radio appearances and podcast appearances and so on. So today, Professor Sapiro will be exploring how we study literature in a globalized world. This evening, she will be sharing her insights on the sociology of world literature, geographic, temporal, and methodological scales. We're very happy to have you here, Gisele, and please join me in extending a warm welcome to Gisèle Sapiro.
Thank you so much, dear Carlos, for this generous presentation and also for inviting me here. Thanks to Julia Schreiner, who organized this talk here today. Thanks to the Center for hosting me. It's a great pleasure and honor to open your series of lectures and discussions on this issue of scale. And I've been trying to work about the material I processed in the book in a way to address your question of scale, and it's a bit experimental, you will see. So if world literature is defined as text that circulate following David Damrosch's suggestion to change the focus on world literature from Weltliteratur to world literature that circulates, a sociological approach needs to ask which text circulates, how do they cross borders or not, and under what conditions. So answering these questions calls a study of the circulation of literary work combining three different geographic scales of observation, macro, meso, and micro. The macro scale of translation flows within the word book market and international regulation like the Berne Convention on authors' rights, institutions like the UNESCO and authorities such as the Nobel Prize, which contributed to unify a transnational literary field. The mesoscale of socio-historical configurations, mostly at the national level, because the national fields form arena for specific competition between intermediaries, publishers, editors, literary agents, state representatives, translators and mediators, critics, around the import and export of literary work. So you have these national fields, which is the mesoscale, and you have the microscale of individual and collective practices and strategies. So if I can give examples, this would be the macro scale. You have the data for yearly evolution of average of translated books in the 80s and the 90s per year. And you can see per language of origin, and you can see the share of different languages. You can see that, for instance, English was close to 45% of the overall share of translations in the world, and in the globalization period it moved to 59%. Usually you would think that there is more diversification, and you can see that on the contrary, it's the dominance of English. At the mesoscale, this would be another kind of comparison, then comparing the evolution of translation into German, French, Italian, and Spanish, and whatever language. Then we turn to the national fields, and we see what they import and how much they import. And then we can do a comparison at the meso level. Another meso level could be that, comparing the concentration of translations in cities, in countries and cities in the French area is the most concentrated around Paris. It's 80% of the translations that from English that are published in Paris, and it's much more than the translation. It's here. It's 89% in France and 83% in Paris, and you can see that the Anglophone sphere is less centralized because you have two centers, one in London and one in New York, and a historical reversal of power between the two. And this would be the micro level, the interviews, for instance, with actors, here publisher, who just mentioned his motivation for doing some actions, which you can see are not always rational, contrary to the idea of the rational action theory. You can see that we can use Max Weber to understand rationality with relation to values rather than economic rationality or interest. And it's interesting because you know that publishing house is a firm and they have to make money, and still you see sometimes we do irresponsible things. I would plead guilty. Sometimes we do totally crazy things. So it could be irrational, but it's not because it's because otherwise you don't. Then you are not a publisher. Then you just can't sell anything. So this is just examples, but studying the circulation of literary works also requires a periodization to distinguish socio-historical configurations. And at the same time, I would not reduce temporal scales to periodization. In her seminal book, The World Republic of Letters, Pascal Casanova contended that time is enshrined in the accumulation of symbolic capital and in orchestrating the unequal power relations around what she called the meridian of Greenwich, defining degrees of advancement or backwardness with regards to modernity and the innovations happening at the center. It is a different notion of temporality that I want to address here, although it also includes Casanova's analysis, the temporal scale of human action and practices in these transfers. So I will claim, echoing Braudel, that these practices are embedded in a triple temporality, the longue durée of institutions and categories of perception, and the unequal distribution of economic and symbolic capital, which underlie the structure of the transnational and national fields. In our case, the book market and the national literature. So you saw the centers I showed before, Paris, London. These centers are there in the book market since the 17th century. So it's very longue durée structure that is very slow to move. New York, it took 200 years to raise to the level of London and to change the power relation. So there are struggles, but it's very difficult to change this power relation between centers and peripheries. And then we have the midterm scale of socio-historical configuration. And they depend first of all upon political power relations, which determine censorship, the dominant ideology, and the international power relations and struggles, for instance, in times of war or conflict like the Cold War, and also publishing practices and literary genre. And I'm thinking of Moretti's studies of the rise of literary genre in different countries. You can see it's midterm temporal scale. And the short-term scale is that which is inscribed in human strategies, competition, negotiation strategies that for introducing foreign authors. And my claim is that all these three temporalities act always in a combined way in each moment. The same thing like the geographic scale. They all contribute to determine human action. So all these strategies in the short term are framed by habituses and practices that are more or less codified in the midterm, like contract selling for foreign rights, which can evolve in time. For instance, after World War II, contracts started to introduce a clause requesting that the integrity of the text be respected and no cuts be made without the authorization of the author. This I found in the archive, and this happened in the context of the revision of the International Convention on Authorship, first adopted in Bern in 1886, and it became standardized as a clause in contracts. So the practices also changed. Then the text would be more fully, integrally translated from that moment on, which was not the case before. As you know, Zola was translated, was censored, so self-censored by the publisher and the translator, which didn't prevent them to go to get prosecuted and even to go to prison. But so this could not happen without the authorization. So sometimes the author gives the authorization for censorship, for instance. It happens a lot, but it needs the authorization. Zola, by the way, was giving it to Christophe Schall just published a study on Zola's correspondence, and there is a lot of this. They say, you got whatever you think would offend or be problematic. Another example in the interwar period it was that to introduce a foreign author, it was common in French publishing to ask a famous French writer to pen a preface. So this practice has now disappeared after the Second World War, and it was not common anymore to ask for a preface, but it was used to do this. So to navigate across these scales, I use Bourdieu's concept of field, which I have tried in my work to extend to the transnational scale and to clarify in a socio-historical perspective based on this theoretical and empirical, on his theoretical work, but also on myself and my own work, and including also more recent publications or unpublished notes by Bourdieu on field theory, and so my own work and other empirical studies done by scholars in different parts of the world. And of course, field theory implies that we also take into account different scales of valuation, like scales, the scale of commercial criteria versus the aesthetic judgment. That in the publishing field, that this is what Bourdieu developed about the publishing field, that it is split between the commercial criteria and the more, and these are expressions used by the actors. I didn't ask them about that, but they use spontaneously the notion of upmarket, literary upmarket, serious books. So it's a category which is valued according to different criteria than sales. And they need that because they need the symbolic capital also. We also need the concept of habituses, and just one word about fields. One idea about the notion of field and relative autonomy is that it can be there can be discrepancy across fields in terms of temporality, for instance, between the literary field and the art field. So the developments are partly autonomous from other, of course, from the political and from the economic. So they can be impacted by changes in those fields, but there is a temporal specific development. So this also needs to be taken into account. And we also need the concept of habitus and practices to understand the articulation of temporal scales. Institutional inertia and hysteresis of habituses ensure the reproduction of practices, but this reproduction can be challenged by symbolic revolutions and also by the importation of foreign models, genre, and publishing practices. Conversely, the change of practices can encounter the hysteresis of the habituses and the inertia of institutions. When the changes become dominant in a field, reversing the power relation, we enter a new state of the field, and it can happen through autonomous factors, such as symbolic revolutions, changes in the publishing model through the circulation of or new professional norms, or through heteronomous factors such as political constraints, censorship, control of publishing, imposing of an aesthetics, like for instance socialist realism that was imposed in Eastern European on Eastern European artists after the Second World War. So in this talk, I will instantiate these different scales based on my recent book, Qu'est-ce qu'un auteur mondial? What is a world author? That Carlos kindly presented. And in this book, I take up the question posed by Foucault, what is an author? Where he argues that the author function, meaning the attribution of a series of texts to a proper name, is the product of censorship and the market, the literary property. And I crossed Foucault's question with Bourdieu's question, who creates the author? And in his paper on the production of belief, belief in the value of the artwork, Bourdieu insisted on the role of cultural intermediaries, especially the publishers or art galleries in the field of art, visual art, and he insisted on their role in the construction of the author's reputation and the transfer of symbolic capital from the publisher's mark, for instance Gallimard, or Zurkam, to the author. For debut authors. Of course, there is also there are authors like Édition de Minuit. The director, the publisher was saying that it was Beckett who did the Édition de Minuit because he decided to publish Beckett while Beckett had been refused by all others. And Jérôme Lindon said that Édition de Minuit was created by Beckett. In his seminal article on the social conditions of the international circulation of ideas, Bourdieu also launched a research program, I think that's the next, yes, on the role of importers, distinguishing three operations: selection, marking, and interpretation. Indeed, the circulation of works beyond the geographic and temporal borders within which they were created requires a specific methodology to understand how and why they circulate and how and why they are appropriated in the reception culture. As Bourdieu stressed following Marx, this geographic and temporal displacement can produce misunderstandings, and these misunderstandings result from the issues at stake in the reception fields and the interest and strategies of the importers. These interests and strategies need to be resituated in the different scales I introduced, since the micro scale is in large part, as I said, determined by the meso and macro constraints and the temporal and the geographic altogether. For this reason, in the book I distinguished three periods, three socio-historical configurations in the formation of a progressively unified transnational literary field, partly unified, which is still not entirely and maybe will never happen, but the internationalization of a Eurocentric market for translation in the first half of the 20th century, its transnationalization in a developmentalist post-war context with the rise of book fairs and the opening of the geopolitical horizons to non-Western cultures, and then the era of globalization with the intensification of translation and the multiplication of book fairs and literary festivals across the world in a conjuncture of the rise of financial capitalism. And I shall present these three configurations and try to articulate different geographic and temporal scales. So, the first period, the process of internationalization, and it's not opposed, it goes together, internationalization, because the international organization fostered the development of national identities and national states. So the process of internationalization that accompanied the affirmation of national identities culminated in the interwar period. politically marked by the creation of the League of the Nations and of cultural diplomacy. This process had very concrete repercussions in the literary field and in publishing practices, where national categories became a principle of perception and structuring for a booming translation market, as well as for the abundant production of anthologies, panoramas, and literary histories. Thus, in the interwar period, national identities became editorial categories. Interestingly, this categorization practice started in the academic field, and also this book shows that academia and the academic field had a role in all this organization of the transnational literary field. It was fostered by the specialization in languages and civilizations. The main difference with anthologies of national literature produced in the 19th century is that those were produced by nationals, first of all, for national purposes of establishing a national canon. You had a lot of national anthologies in the 19th century. The editorial trend I describe in the interwar period is different. These anthologies and panoramas are written by specialists of these literatures who belong to the reception culture, thus creating a transnational canon which may be different from the national canon. And some examples, so the pioneer role of academia as a mediating field has to be, as I said, underscored. Many of these panoramas were initially written by academics specializing in foreign literature, such as Calvin Thomas, Professor of Germanic Languages and Literature at Columbia, author in 1909 of A History of German Literature, published by Appleton in Boston and Heinemann in London, and editor of an anthology of German literature published by Heath the same year. Or you have Williamson Updike Vreeland, Professor of Romanced Languages at Princeton, and editor of an anthology of French prose and poetry published in 1910 by Athenaeum Press in Boston. Some contribute to the creation of the field of study, as in the case of Japanology, pioneered in Germany by Dr. Karl Florenz, trained in Germanistic and comparative literature. A lecturer and then full professor at Kyoto University from 1889 onwards, Florenz was appointed Germany's first professor of Japanology at the Colonial Institute in Hamburg in 1914. And he wrote an anthology of Japanese poetry, Japanische Dichtungen, in 1894, sorry for the pronunciation, followed by history of Japanese literature, Geschichte für japanische Literatur, published in 1906. And this history is the 10th volume of the series Die Literaturen des Ostens in Einzeldarstellungen, Eastern Literature, I don't know how to translate it, in individual presentation. I asked Carlos to help me translate this notion into French, and it was hard to find an expression. So this series was launched in 1901 by the Amelang Publishing House in Leipzig, and it was covering the literatures of Eastern Europe, Polish, Russian, Hungarian, Romanian, and Czech, and Asia, Chinese, Arabic, Indian. So it was all the East, from the Eastern Europe to the Far East. Introduced by specialist academics, the volumes were organized by language and covered both classical and modern literature, helping to legitimize the latter as national literatures. Heinemann launched a whole series of short histories of the literatures of the world. You can see here the list. The role of scholarly diplomats should also be highlighted, such as another founder of Japanology, the British philologist William George Aston, author of A History of Japanese Literature, published by Cambridge University Press in 1899. And also a specialist in Korean language and literature. These scholars were often also translators. Michel Revon, professor of law at the University of Tokyo and legal advisor to the Japanese government before taking up a lectureship in the history of Far Eastern civilization at the Faculté de Lettres in Paris, was preparing an anthology of Japanese literature from its origins to the 20th century, published by De la Grave in 1906. In the interwar period, as intellectual journals, essays, on foreign cultures and travelogues flourished in the wake of the internationalist effervescence, anthologies and panoramas of national literature moved out of the realm of scholarship to become a publishing genre in their own right, aimed at introducing foreign literature to local audiences. A rare example of universal approach is poet and translator Yvan Goll, alias Isaac Lang, his anthology of contemporary poetry entitled Les Cinq Continents, The Five Continents, with La Renaissance du Livre in 1922, and the poems were organized by language groups, starting with the Anglo-Saxon group. In 1928, editor of an anthology of new American poetry directed by writer and translator Eugène Jolas, Simon Kra, so the publisher, launched a collection of a series of panorama des littératures contemporaines composed and introduced by critics specializing in these literatures. So La littérature allemande by Félix Berthaud, La littérature espagnole by critic Jean Cassou, who was since 1921 writing the Lettres Espagnoles, so the rubric for Spanish literature, the column for Spanish literature in the prestigious journal Mercure de France, La littérature américaine, which started to emerge on the transnational scene, the international scene at the time, by Régis Michaud, who was professor of French at the University of California and author of a scholarly work on Le roman américain d'aujourd'hui, published in 1926 by Boivin. So you see, he's a professor of French in the US, but he's writing about American literature for French audience. At the Noël and Still, critic Georges Charançol launched a series of anthologies by country in the Contemporary Foreign Novelists collection. The first volume in the series, published in 1931 under the direction of Victor Lona, was also devoted to American novelists. The same year saw the publication of Les Romanciers Italiens, in which Benjamin Crémieux collected short stories by authors such as Pirandello and Svevo. In 1932, Les Romanciers Allemands, edited by Félix Berthaud, brought short stories by Arthur Schnitzler, Heinrich Mann, Thomas Mann, Jakob Wassermann, Alfred Döblin, Franz Werfel, Kafka was there, of course, Zweig, Roth, and many others. In 1935, the édition de la NRF, oh, sorry, I was not on the right, so this was the, sorry. In 1935, the Édition de la NRF, the former name for Gallimard, published an anthology de la littérature soviétique, coedited by Ukrainian Mark Slonim, literary critic and translator from Russian into French, who was a member of the Russian Constituent Assembly in 1918, and his co-author was the Belarusian-born Irishman George Rivy, poet and translator from Russian into English, with links to the Irish avant-garde Joyce and Beckett, and also with Eugène Jolas' magazine Transition. It was a French-American magazine. With the exception of the United States, it's rarer to see generalist publishers venturing outside Europe. After an anthology des conteurs hongrois d'aujourd'hui, the publisher Reader published an anthology des conteurs chinois modernes, so Chinese narrators in 1929. It was prepared by a student translator, Ying Yin Yi, at the instigation of the editors of the review Europe, which was Romain Rolland review, and which was trying to open the geographic horizon. But it was Goettner, a scholarly publisher specializing in Asia, that published an anthologie de la poésie japonaise in 1935, edited and translated by Orientalist Georges Bonneau, author of the Professor of La sensibilité japonaise, Japanese sensibility. So he had won 3 prizes from the Imperial Japanese University, attesting to the interest of the countries in this kind of endeavors to publish about their literatures, and he won other prizes. The same phenomenon was observed in other European countries. It's not specific to France. I can give some example. 1933, for example, the Slovak publisher Matica published an anthology of French lyric poetry, edited and translated by Lukács. In 1939, an anthology of Italian lyric poetry, translated by a collective, was published in Croatian. In 1941, as the fascist regime tightened its grip, the publisher Bompianu still managed to publish an American anthology edited by the progressive writer Elio Vittorini, the first introducer of American literature in Italy. And similarly, in Franco-Spain, there were volumes of Antologia de Literatura Francesa and others. You could see also anthologies of Latin American literatures per country, so Panama, Costa Rica, Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. So this proliferation of anthologies and panoramas operate at a meso scale within national fields, but also contribute to the formation of a transnational field, since authors translated in one place tended to be translated also in other, based on the imitation principle. And I rely here on the neo-functionalist theory by DiMaggio and Powell, who highlighted three mechanisms of imitation between firms. So I transposed that to the publishing market. So competition, constraint, and professional norms. But I combine this imitation principle with that of differentiation, because in the publishing market, we also have to assert originality and difference. And here, so competition within the national field is operating, but publishers imitate foreign publishers in order to differentiate themselves in the national publishing field. So at the meso-geographic level, since differentiation is a driving force in the market for symbolic goods, which values originality, counterbalancing the mimetic drive. These new practices transform the national and transnational literary field and publishing field in the midterm, framing the practices and the representations altogether. And we can say that it also shaped the representation in the long run, because we are still thinking in these national categories. Although they have been challenged in the longer run, so this editorial category participated in legitimizing in the long run national identities as a category of perception and classification, which is still efficient in the transnational literature field. We still speak of German literature, French literature, American literature, Italian literature, and all for all nationalities, despite attempts to denationalize the literary history, and despite the questioning of the historical identification between languages and nation states, which obscures the literary production of the peripheries of linguistic areas, like, for instance, Swiss literature, which is divided at least between three languages, German, French, and Italian, and of course, post-colonial literature. And these categories have become so naturalized that it requires an epistemological effort to trace back how they were established and became efficient in the scholarly and emic worldview of literature. Among the national literatures emerging at the time, American literatures acquired particular visibility thanks to the active role of transatlantic intermediaries and the interest it aroused in the French literary field. The case of the importation of William Faulkner, it's one of chapters of the book, illustrates on a micro scale the chain of cooperation that helped install this unknown author from a peripheral region in the country that was then at the center of the World Republic of Letters, to use Casanova's phrase. Based on the Gallimard archives, my study highlighted the role of intermediaries, translators, and mediators, in particular Maurice Edgar Coindreau, a translator who also acted as a kind of scout and intermediary for the publisher, for Gallimard, He was teaching at Princeton. And writers such as André Malraux and Valérie Larbaud, who wrote prefaces, and also Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote critics. So they all contributed in producing the value of Faulkner's work in France, but since the central position of France, it had an impact worldwide. The archives also revealed the competitive struggles between publishers and translators, which helped to reinforce the belief in this value. The publishers determined investment notwithstanding weak sales. So here you see the aesthetic value as opposed to commercial criteria. You can see that the best selling of Faulkner in the 30s is less than 4,000 copies. It's Sanctuary. So you can see that it illustrates the long-term authorial policy that characterized the pole of small-scale circulation of the publishing field according to Bourdieu. So the investment in the long run. On an author, you build his reputation, his oeuvre, even though you don't sell. And this contrasts with the short-term quest for immediate profit at the pole of large-scale circulation, which can be illustrated also by the strategy of Gallimard to publish the French translation of Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell in 1939, and it was immediately a big sale. So it was compensating the investment in such an author. At the micro scale of decision making, I analyzed for instance, the order of publication, the choice to publish first Sanctuary, although the translation of As I Lay Dying was ready to print. And this was a commercial calculation because they hoped that Sanctuary will, sell better than As I Lay Dying, which happened because As I Lay Dying it went 1,000 copies. The choice also, I analyzed the archive is fantastic because the choice of the title. So for instance, Rimbaud, who was the translator of Sanctuary, suggested to translate Sanctuary, Le viol de Temple Drake. So the rape of Temple Drake. He was betting on a scandalous strategy. He compared it to the Lady Chatterley's Lover, who was a big success in translation by Gallimard in the 30s at the time. And Coindreau had said, I cannot translate the Lady Chatterley's Lover, otherwise I will be immediately fired from Princeton. And but the interesting thing that Rimbaud compared a rape with a love story. That's yeah. And the other interesting thing is that Gallimard refused and said, no, we keep the American notion a bit strange, so it's more in translation studies there is the source oriented or target oriented. So you see here is source oriented. We will be more adequate with the original, and we will keep the strangeness of this title in French. And it was also a choice which anchored the novel at the pole of small-scale circulation, very clearly at the aesthetic pole. But if it had been called the Rape of Temple Drake, of course, it could have sold perhaps more, but would have been kind of involved with a scandalous reception. And also I have a wonderful, I cannot develop here, but a wonderful quote of Coindreau advising Gallimard how to translate As I Lay Dying, which is very colloquial phrasing in English and difficult to render in French. So you can see these micro decisions through the archive. A third example of micro-scale decisions is the commissioning of prefaces that I mentioned already to well-known authors like Malraux for Faulkner. And these prefaces frame the reception of the novel. And Malraux, for instance, famously wrote that Faulkner's Sanctuaire, c'est l'intrusion de la tragédie grecque dans le roman policier, the intrusion of Greek tragedy in the detective novel. So it was you can see it's both classifying it in genre, in well-known genre, but on one side you have the highbrow tragedy, which is also places it in the universal canon, and at the same time you have the popular genre of the detective novel, which just emerged, and the mixing of the two makes Faulkner at the cutting edge of the avant-garde, so innovative and daring. And lastly, I also analyzed the decision to translate the very decision to translate all of his works, despite the fact that it was not good sales. Gallimard did not make this choice for all authors. So, for instance, for Dos Passos, they abandoned after the first, because they expected better sales, but he decided really to invest on Faulkner, and you can see he does all this is published in the 30s, which is a lot, of course, and this is an indicator of this authorial policy, betting on the long term. And a long-term investment that was to be rewarded by the Nobel Prize awarded to Faulkner in 1949. Conversely, the French consecration of Faulkner played a pivotal role in his transnational recognition, and here the circularity is solved in time. First, the legitimation of Faulkner by a prestigious French publisher who is at the center of the World Republic of Letters, which draws attention to him from other publishers abroad, and then the Nobel Prize, whose jury was very attentive to the French scene at the moment. This is why I dedicated the first chapter of the second configuration, the chapter 5, to Gallimard's positioning after the Second World War. So in the second configuration, starting in 1945 and ending in around 1978, political and cultural internationalism was reconstituted under the aegis of UNESCO, which replaced the International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation in a context marked by the beginnings of American domination of the New World Order, by the challenges of the Cold War, and soon by decolonization. However, this period also saw the formation of transnational networks. Such networks existed before the war, but literary exchanges tended to emancipate from official relations in a configuration that saw the formation of transnational publishing field organized around international book fairs, especially Frankfurt and later London. One indicator of this transnationalization is the creation of prizes for translated literature, like le Prix du meilleur livre étranger in 1948, the Médicis for foreign literature in 1970, and international prizes such as the ephemeral Fomenter and the Prix International du Livre in 1961, launched by some European publishers as an alternative to the Nobel. Also, the Neustadt International Prize in 1969, which became a landmark all these prizes became a landmark in an international career for a writer. Some other trends are visible during this time period: a slow feminization of the transnational literary field and the broadening of the geocultural horizon to the global south and to the non-Western cultures. Within the transnational publishing field, certain firms had accumulated a transnational symbolic capital that endowed them with a superior power of consecration, as we just mentioned. The case of Gallimard, he consolidated they consolidated their dominant position in the translation market. You can see with the number of Nobel Prize laureates in their list, and you can see it especially happens in the period the 50s. So of course it's the Nobel Prizes both in French and in translation. But all people or writers who are translated in French, they would like first to be translated with Gallimard because of this symbolic capital. During this period, Gallimard diversified. Hanser has a lot in Germany, but less than that. During this period, Gallimard diversified its catalog with 4 collections of foreign literature launched in the 50s. So first, the prestigious Du Monde Entier, which is a series for foreign literature, very highbrow. It's a kind of consecration. La Croix du Sud for Latin American authors, Connaissance de l'Orient for Asian literature, and Littérature soviétique in 1958 for contemporary Russian writers, mostly Russian, to which can be added the Série Noire for detective novel, which was not specifically for translations, but most of the novels published there were translated from English and mostly from American English. Taking part in the European reconstruction, while at the same time establishing itself as one of the main importers of American and English literature into France, Gallimard thus also contributed to the circulation of works by writers from communist countries beyond the Iron Curtain and to the opening of the global translation market to non-Western cultures. The archive of the series Littérature soviétique is quite fascinating because it enabled me to reconstruct the political struggles within the publishers, the publishing house, between the communist writer Aragon, who was the director of the editor of the series, and he also had a privileged position for the negotiation with the Soviet Literary Agency. So he could get the rights for the works. So they needed Aragon, but at the same time in the house there were other people who were anti-communist, so were trying to bring more dissident authors. And there were kind of struggles with Aragon always threatening to abandon everything. And it's interesting to see they were consulting other writers of the house, like Nathalie Sarraute, because she had Russian origins. And also the archives included reading reports, so this was just fascinating, which revealed the selection criteria and contradictory injunctions between aesthetic considerations, ethnographic values, testimony of life in the USSR, and political interests, especially in forms of dissidence or at least heterodoxy. So these three components may intervene in different proportions in the decision to translate foreign literature in general, and more specifically for Soviet literature. Of course, we should add the economic one, which was not prominent here. The sales were not very important, although it is always taken into consideration because a publishing house is a business, so a calculation of costs and sales expectation needs to be made anyhow. In the prestigious series Du Monde Entier, the diversification of languages during this period is notable. So it raised to 24. It was 14 before. And also the number of countries increased. And we can see a change of scale, an opening of geographical horizons to the Middle East with Turkish, it's especially Yashar Kemal, Hebrew, David Shahar, and Arabic. Japanese is the only East Asian language with Mishima, but other authors were published in the other series, Connaissance de l'Orient. And this trend will accelerate in the globalization era. If you compare with what happened after 78, you can see that there are even more languages. It rose to 40 languages and 56 countries, including now Chinese and Korean. So it's a broadening of the geographic scale. And also feminization can be observed in Gallimard's list, with authors like the British Iris Murdoch and Ivy Compton Burnett, the Italian Elsa Morante, and the American Flannery O'Connor, especially from Anglo-American world. Still very much Europeocentric, the transnational publishing field was gradually opening up to non-Western cultures thanks to third world movements, but also thanks to the UNESCO's policy for promoting literary interpenetration. So I dedicated a chapter to this program. And this new institution had an impact on the evolution of the transnational literary field, initially aimed at establishing a new canon of world classics. This policy led, as UNESCO archives revealed, to the creation of what they called representative works. They should be representative of their culture. One of the priorities of the program was East-West dialogue. The program was led by Roger Caillois. You can see him here, a multi-positioned actor at the crossroad. Oh, sorry, I'm hiding Caillois. At the crossroad of several national and transnational networks after his exile in Argentina, where he published the journal Lettres Françaises, and he was involved in the local intellectual life thanks to his intimate relation with Argentinian writer Victoria Ocampo. The activation of these networks ensured that Caillois was able to implement the program himself at Gallimard. So he launched there the series La Croix du Sud, dedicated to Latin America, and he imported in this series Borges, to whom Ocampo had introduced him, with the first title was Fictions, and the translation into French of Fictions attracted the attention of publishers from other countries. So I could find the letters from British publisher, American publisher, Italian publisher, saying, who is this author? We have never heard about him. You have to tell us. They thought Gallimard had the right. So you can see the importance of Gallimard and its visibility. And recently I also was at the Marbach archive, and I saw that German publishers were very much looking at the French lists, what they were publishing. They were really interested to know, not only for French, but also for translations. So Caillois shared the benefits of the UNESCO program with Gallimard beyond his own series, as evidenced by the archives of the series Connaissance de l'Orient, launched by René Etiamble. I cannot develop, there is much more in the book about this, but you can see from this quote that, and also from the figures and the letters, that it was not a commercial operation, but that this series was motivated by pedagogic interests. So here you see we are not looking for immediate commercial success. We want to educate the public, to enlighten the Orient for them, and so on. And you can see that the sales are quite poor, but still they continue to invest, and it did bring a body of work from these countries, both classic and contemporary works. And here again, the archive allowed to see that cooperation was not without friction, rivalry and bitter negotiation at all levels between publishing houses, between managers, between UNESCO and Gallimard, nor was it free from ethnocentrism and a feeling of Western superiority that is still widely prevalent among the literate elite today, I must say, despite the decentralization impelled at UNESCO by Claude Lévi-Strauss and anthropologists. So you can see at the time, even Caillois, he was still in this mind. This decentralization is nevertheless reflected in one of the program's flagship achievements in France, the Trésor de la Poésie Universelle, 1959, co-edited by Caillois and the poet and translator Jean-Clarence Lambert, whom I had the chance the opportunity to interview, thanks to William Marx, who introduced me to him and brought me to him in countryside. And the project shows that the role of the avant-garde, the avant-garde played a role in recognizing these global South, non-Western and indigenous literatures, like it happened with art objects in the first half of the century. It was surrealist poet André Breton who recommended to Lambert to translate, for instance, Octavio Paz, which he considered as a great poet, and Lambert learned Spanish to translate his poetry and published it after it was refused by Gallimard. And Lambert describes how he was, at the time he had no resources. He was working in a place to do cheese, and he was in the cheese factory, among the Gruyère and all this, and learning Spanish to translate Octavio Paz. And it was Paz who recommended to Lambert to include in his 1961 Anthology of Mexican Poetry, pre-Columbian poetry, a juxtaposition that was praised by Lévi-Strauss but provoked a huge scandal in Mexico, because how can you mix Mexican literature with pre-Columbian literature? So it was Paz who recommended that. His anthology of world literature includes such poetry from all over the world, the poetry, and he told interestingly how Kaiwa helped him to classify it. So the classification was made by, he was collecting the translation of the poems, and Kaiwa was classifying them. Finally, the program works resulted in 570 translations into French and English. While introduced non-Western authors in the West, it also benefited actually to the dominant English and French publishers, which contributed to the recognition of these Oriental classics and of some contemporary authors. So here is the languages that were translated with the program and number of titles. There were very few translations in other languages. The idea is that UNESCO's languages is French and English, so we have to focus on that. The gradual opening up to non-Western cultures can be observed at the same time in the Nobel Prize for Literature, a supranational authority that organizes and unifies competition between national literatures since the beginning of the century. Nomination lists from 1960 to 1972, letters of recommendation and Nobel Committee reports allowed me to understand how this opening of the geocultural horizon happened. So you can see here, if you compare the nominations of 62 and 69, you can see that there are more languages appearing. I won't go into detail, it's just to show, you can see here a number of recommendations per country. Sorry to hide it. So you can see Vietnam, for instance, appearing there, Iran appearing. So Latin America, after Gabriela Mistral won the prize in 1945, appeared in the map of the Nobel Prize. In 67 it was Asturias, in 71 Neruda, in 82 Marquez. Asia appeared with the Japanese Kawabata. And later Sub-Saharan Africa with Wole Soyinka, and the Arab world with Naguib Mahfouz. So in the nomination letters, I could show the different treatment of famous Western authors like Sartre and Malraux, and sometimes you get letters just with one name, Sartre, Malraux. We don't need to explain, you know, or say, oh, I won't offend the committee to introduce Sartre. Of course, they know Sartre. I just will underscore his influence. And then you have on the other side these very long letters with sometimes translation, very argued to defend, to promote these non-Western authors, or sometimes Eastern European. And the most beautiful letter I found, it was Roman Jakobson's letter for Seifert in the 60s, which was used afterwards for expertise, and I quote it extensively, and I asked for the permission because it's so beautiful, so well argued, so, you know, and compared to the others just with one name, so it was interesting. So Seifert won it, but in much later, so it took like 15 years until he won it. And often for non-Western Global South author, they would say there are not enough translations, we don't have the expertise, so I examined cases such as that of the Egyptian Taha Hussein, who was promoted by André Gide, laureate of the Nobel Prize in 1947. And he was Gide's translator into Arabic, and Gide recommended his work to Gallimard for a French translation and wrote an introduction to his autobiography, which is interestingly not Orientalist at all, and he's just stressing that it's the loss of landmark disorientation by a blind man. So he stresses his blindness rather than his cultural origin. There is also the case of Chinese Lin Yutang, who was a very international, had a very international trajectory. I cannot develop, but so there were candidates that were very, very serious at the time. And also for women, although more women gained transnational recognition at this time, their chances of achieving the supreme consecration remained limited until 1990, despite an increase in recommendation concerning them. So in 1962, there were only 3 names of women among 69 candidates nominated. It rose a little in 65, a little more. And then, but there were serious candidates. There was Nathalie Sarraute, Marguerite Yourcenar, there was Ingeborg Bachmann, Anna Segers. There were many, Maria Dobrowska, many serious, Simone de Beauvoir. They did not consider sharing the prize between Sartre and Beauvoir, for instance. But they were considering Beauvoir seriously, but you know, you cannot, you have France, so if it's Sartre, it cannot be Beauvoir, because it will take some time until another French get it. So for this reason, I speak in this case of the reproduction of intersectional domination, reproduction as defined by Bourdieu and Passeron with regard to the school institution, which involuntarily reproduced and legitimized class social relation. So I use here the notion of reproduction rather than refraction. That is what is used to think about autonomy of fields, because refraction is what is retranslated within the field according to the logics of the field. But here it's, my argument is that the field's autonomy is based on, has impure foundation based on prejudice and cognitive biases that are detrimental to the purity of aesthetic judgment. So they were not able to do correct, proper aesthetic judgment because of these cognitive biases. It's the contrary of the argument saying, you know, these, and some of them were saying that these literature are seen backward and they have not raised to the level of the universal level of the European literature, and same thing for women and so on. I reverse here the arguments. So I will end with the, I'm sorry, I'm a little long maybe, globalization. Is it okay? The globalization era, which starts around 78, when the globalization became a motto for which replaced development, as Emanuel Wallerstein pointed. This time period is marked by an intensification of transcultural exchanges. The number of translations increased plus 50% between 1980 and 2000, according to the UNESCO Index Translationum. But the languages that has increased most is English. We saw that before. Well, the share of translation from Russian was falling from 12.5% to 2.5% after the fall of the communist regime. So the 10% won by the English counterbalance, it was also taking over the Eastern European market. Moreover, the scale of transcultural exchanges had broadened with the proliferation of book fairs around the world, from Peking to Guadalajara through Ouagadougou, followed by the proliferation of literary festivals everywhere. And the diversification of exchanges is observable in the nationalities, ethnic diversity, and gender of authors. This period is marked by feminization, attention to minorities, migrants, and post-colonial authors. It can be seen in the choices of the Swedish Academy between 1990 and 2022. So you can see the share of Nobel laureates per country, and you can see that since 1990, I hope you can see here, you have more of these other regions of the world. And at the same time, diversification masks in the choice of the laureates, masks the increasing dominance of the English language in the selection process, both in terms of number of laureates writing in that languages and the weight of two competing bodies, the Neustadt Prize and the Booker Prize. So there is more impact of these prizes on trajectories of international authors who may get the Nobel if they, for instance, so they are trying to correct the bias So these biases, they're reading closely the production around the Nobel Prize that Carlos and Jürgen are part of this important group working on the Nobel. So there are more non-Western, and this year it was Han Kang, first Asian woman and first Korean author who won the Nobel, but she had won the Booker Prize before. Another prize, as I said, which is correlated with Nobel is the Neustadt. Before this period, it was the French Prix du meilleur livre étranger. So we can see the switch from the French centrality of the Nobel of the transnational literary field to the Anglo-American. So the delay. It took some time until the Nobel adjusted to these new changes, feminization and also opening. And the delay indicates the institutional inertia, not only for an old institution like the Nobel, but also for more recent prizes, which refer to the different rates of feminization or recognition of female authors. So I think the Booker Prize and the Man Booker were the first, so the Anglophone sphere was the one who drove the translation, the rewarding of female authors, and you can see that other prizes followed, like the Büchner Prize, the Cervantes Prize, it happened later, and also for the Nobel. So this is the reason why I argue that the driving force for this evolution, the feminization, and the opening of the borders to also the interest in migrants and post-colonial authors came from the Anglophone sphere, which became dominant. And of course, beyond institutional inertia, one should also count with individual and collective representations and cognitive bias, or even prejudices. And I just wanted to cite this article by Lundqvist in 1977, which was titled To Whom the Nobel Prize, where he said that literatures of Asia, Africa, and others, even more distant, he expressed a doubt that there was much to draw there, because he said they were lagging behind the West. And he said these are literatures that, apart from Japan in particular, have apparently not reached the level of evolution, artistic, psychological, and linguistic, that could allow them to have real importance outside their original context. So this was in 1977, and there was a big scandal because of this claim, and he reiterated that in 1980. So you could interpret that with Casanova's notion of the Greenwich Meridian, and saying, yeah, there is innovation that is not yet reached, but I think the generality of the statement, which is applied blindly to cultures, indicates a heteronomous judgment based on prejudice. And he repeated that later. So I think the growing inclusiveness was the result of the increased domination of English, also for post-colonial authors and others. I skip a little here, and I just wanted also to mention the book fairs and also especially the literary festival that I studied. So these were the prizes. You can see only 3 women in the Büchner Prize until 1990. The rise of a literature festival. So this is again at the macro scale. You can see this development, and you can see that it reproduces sometimes the trends of the book market. But some international festivals that I study, especially the Berlin Festival, try to oppose these trends and to be much more multicultural, and also to introduce cultures that are not visible, like inviting Korean poets to the festival, even though they are not translated into German. I won't speak about the last chapter of the book is the reverse of power relation between France and the US, and the fact that French literature today is translated only at the pole of small-scale circulation. So these are the audiences of festival. So I could show that there are more women translated into English, and all the nationalities that are translated from French into English, but still we have the idea of national literature. So these are the translations from the French, all the 30 nationalities, but still we speak of French literature. So this is the reception field of, this is the meso level, the reception field of French literature in the US, and this is the micro level with interviews. So at the moment when the US was really closing and not wanting to translate anymore, there is some publishers were trying to fight this by bringing translations into the US. So I won't really conclude. I just want to show this. I did this attempt to synthesize this I did for this talk. I hadn't tried it before. So to cross these two scales, temporal and geographic, and to see how I could fit the different kind of practices and objects of study at these different levels. And I stop here. Sorry for being too long.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We have time for questions. I might start with one question. I find it so interesting that there's this first move in terms of methodology that in literary sociology we really try to leave behind this methodological nationalism that has created the perspectives of how to analyze literature for such a long time. But when I look at your reconstruction, it seems, well, maybe literary sociology has left methodological nationalism behind, but on the level of the actors, nationalism is everywhere. It's on the micro scale, the meso scale, the macro scale. So what is your observation on this? Why has nationalism, that there's all this rhetoric on internationalization and globalization, universalization and so on, but still the national is so important and so strong in how the actors in the literary field describe themselves? And do you have any ideas why this is so incredibly resistant to the opening up of perspectives?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos. So that's a great question. Of course, I don't think literary sociology should totally abandon methodological nationalism. I think it's still important for comparativism, but at the condition that you take into account the global, the transnational power relations between these cultures, and also all these exchanges that happen, because the problem of the national history is that they were blind to these contributions from other cultures to the inner evolution of the field. So if we take into account translation, we can understand much more of the developments of the national fields. But still, as I tried to show, so and I wrote a paper where, more in general, I tried to articulate field theory with this question of transnational perspective. National fields are a kind of what Bourdieu used to call a fiction bien fondée, a fiction that was well established by history. They were created, national states, you look at Anne-Marie Thiers' work, were established by creating literature, national literature, national music, national art. So it was part of the construction, and we have been teaching literary history for decades through these lenses. So there is what we call the path dependency, which happens with national fields. There is a specific history of national fields, although it should not obscure the circulation that happened, the exchange, and also it should not obscure the fact that these national fields were always positioning themselves in competition with other national fields. So even Italy under fascism, there is work by scholars showing that they were so anxious to get Italian literature translated in other languages and to achieve the status of Italian literature in the transnational, in the international competition. So my idea was to show that internationalization was dominant, so nationalization and internationalization was dominant in the interwar period since the end of the 19th century. Starting in the 50s, I speak of the transnational networks because publishing is, so the publishing, of course, is framed by national borders. You have censorship, you have laws, you have firms established in the country. So, but at the same time, language is not identified contrary to our representation with one nation. And you have also multilingual states, but you have languages that are all over the place. And so the publishers would tend to, this is what I showed in this, the publishers would try to spread, they have interest to go beyond the borders. So, so when you publish a translation from German in Paris, you want it to be in all the Francophone area, although it does not circulate. I have proofs that they don't circulate, but they want the word rights, right? So they are covering the whole area. So this is why the publishing field, its borders is not only the national. The linguistic borders are different. And then you have the translation that can go, also the migrations and all this, that you can see this transnationalization. And globalization is another trend that I try to show that became dominant at that moment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. More questions, observations, comments, please.
Thanks a lot for your inspiring lecture. The German Goethe Institute has an own program for translation, funded by the Foreign Office, Auswärtiges Amt. And we created quota to support small languages. If not, the overwhelming majority of translations would be in English. So what's your opinion on the creation of such quotas?
Yeah, of course. So thank you for bringing that. National policies are another factor that makes nations still actors in this market. But having studied the French policy, I can see also the evolution of this policy and also the Hebrew policy from more state policy, political policy towards the market, more and more embedded. So they know they cannot support works that would not be expected, asked, demanded by publishers. And they work with publishers. They don't try to publish their own. So this is one important aspect of the thing. And the other thing is that, so I know for the French policy that not only the translation from the French to other languages that they support, but also they created in IT9 a program for translation into French, which is very rare. It happens for classics usually and not for contemporary literature. And they did it on purpose, and I did some interviews, and I have also the trace of this program to support other literatures into French. But also the fact that some countries would have support for the exportation of their literature is also a kind of asset in this international. So here the nation states continue also to play a role. But I think I'm in favor of these policies, because otherwise I think also that English will take over. And the same thing, you can see that a series of foreign literatures, it seems strange today with a transnational perspective to separate French from foreign literature, you know, or national literature from foreign literature. And also in French, it's ridiculous. You have, for instance, Canadian or Swiss literature in French literature, and because it's not translated, and then you have foreign literature. But at the same time, if these series are suppressed, it will be in favor of the dominant language, because these series have their own logic of diversification of languages. The English is dominant there, but it's only 1/3, while in the market, broad market, it's 2/3 of the translation from English. So these series have their logic of supporting, diversifying the languages.
I have now 4 more questions on my list. Benjamin, I have 5, 6. Okay, so we have to keep our questions and answers compact.
Yeah, the answers should be more compact.
Thank you for the insightful talk. I found it quite plausible, everything you said about the 20th century, which seems to have been good times for both literature and translation, but I would really be curious to know a bit more about the new factors since 2000. If you maybe could give some kind of outlook, how all you have observed for the globalization period maybe is changing in times that seem to go in a post-global way and affect deeply the functioning of book markets, kind of artificial intelligence, on the micro scale maybe like digital shaping of authorship and all that stuff. So maybe give like an outlook for the future.
Yeah, that would be another research, but still, thank you for the question, and I think it's important to think about it. And now I was hearing on the radio that now publishers are contracting authors with the selling rights for artificial intelligence, which is a kind of a dilemma for the authors, because either you're not in the, you refuse that, but then you know, you do not contribute to the kind of knowledge that is being built there, and your work can be used without your. So they offered like something like 2,000 euros or something like that to sign these contracts. Yeah. So, but you know, this part of the literary field, I think, will survive somehow, although the canon is challenged since the 80s, the authorities are challenged, the Nobel Prize challenged, there has been a counter Nobel Prize given to Maryse Condé, but still it's based on literary criteria and the value of the illusio, as Bourdieu says, in literature. I think this will survive. Maybe it won't have the same societal importance because it's not anymore linked to the cultural identities of the nation states. This is what I can say very briefly, and I see Carlos nervous with time.
It's me already. Thanks so much. I think you made it quite clear that the work is informed by Foucault and Bourdieu, but the one who came to my mind first was Fernand Braudel. Mm-hmm. And not just because he split up the speed of history, but because he shifted the focus away from the history of events to the history of long durée. And I think it would underline or strengthen the argument that the long-term perspective is much more important when it comes to the establishment or introduction of new authors in the global field, and that the short-term decisions were kind of risky, but less important than the long-term perspective. So is it something you could consider, or?
Yes, of course. I cited Braudel when I said the scales, that I was echoing Braudel, but I didn't develop very much. So you're right to. So I'm not a historian, I'm a historical sociologist, so my references are more. But of course, you're totally right, and I think I agree with what you said, and I think it fits perfectly, and I could go further on this because this reflection was built a little for this talk. So I've written before about these time scales, but and I think with field theory it's really interesting, and also the habitus and all this to think more about this coexistence of different time scales at the same moments. Thank you.
Bitte sehr.
I was interested because the first thing I noticed was that at the moment when there's suddenly interest in a panopticon of the world for European audiences, that do you think, so question number one, do you think it's a reaction to the World Expo culture? That certainly would be the case if you look at the other side, for example, Japan, where not only the opening of a Meiji era, but also this World Expo opens up a kind of dispositive for looking at the rest of the world as a kind of amusement park for a local audience.
Yeah, you speak of the Exposition Universelle. Yes, of course. Yeah, it's an important.
But the more important point that I wanted to ask you about is: do you have any data? I know it must be difficult about publications in other languages that are not official, that are not part of the European Eurocentric copyright market, but that are happening anyway. If you go to like the market in Valparaiso or in China or whatever, there's a lot of translations not on the register, right?
Of course.
How do you
but we are filmed now, so I cannot exactly answer. Of course, and I saw in the archive. So the publishers started tracking. They were hiring people in these countries to find out if there was pirate publication. So they were and there are many countries who are not in the USSR for decades, has not been in the Berne Convention, and Iran, for instance, now is not, and they do translate for sure. And it's about it's a very interesting question, because about we don't have this. Although I don't know how much the figures of the index translationum, they just work on what is translated. They don't care about copyright. So it might be that the problem is the quality of the source. It's national libraries, so it's not always very easy. Sorry.
I'm part of a research group with Carlos Spoerhase and Erika Tomala and among others here. And we're looking at the interplay between authors and publishing houses and censorship in the first half of the 19th century. And I wondered, because you just touched upon this topic briefly, if you could expand a little bit on the role of the censorship, how you are looking at it.
Yeah, I discussed that a little more in the book. But actually, I've worked on censorship, but for the difficulty with censorship is that it's very nationally based. And so I've written a very long book about the history of censorship in France, literary trials since the beginning of the 19th century, and how what was the role of the writers in expanding the freedom of expression in France. Their struggles, their arguments, the trials, how it worked, and all this. And of course, it's happening in translation, and even I would say that the censorship is always harsher for foreign publications. So sometimes foreign publications, so I know that, for instance, Henry Miller was publishing in France because he couldn't publish in English, because he couldn't publish in his country. So there were these circulations that were related to censorship. I also found in a recent archive, very interestingly, that Beckett, I think it was, I don't remember, it was not Malone-Murr, it was Molloy, I think, that was blocked at the frontier of the English translation of Canada. It was stopped by the douane, custom officers, and then there is a whole discussion between the publisher and the custom officers. And I have the whole thing. I just summarized it very shortly because I found it. The book was almost finished, and it's just fascinating to see how they convince them that it's literature and it's not pornography. So that's always the discussion. And there is after the Second World War a mobilization for Henry Miller. There are many. I gave the example for whether to translate. Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned in England. So
Okay, great. Two last questions. Please keep things short, Julian Schröter.
So I have a question regarding your final order of scales, or this table. And my question would be, the question whether some item within this scheme, for example, genre,
Yes.
is midterm and meso or long-term macro, for example, is a epistemological question or methodological question, or rather really or ontological question. So are some genres in fact long-term macro genres? So I liked your when you said that you took the idea of midterm genres from Franco Moretti, and there was another scholar in English literature, Ted Underwood, who showed, based on a different scale of research, that some genres would actually be long-term in a way. Yes. And in some way it's a matter of how you look at genres, and then you have some hypothesis regarding whether something is in fact this or that. So perhaps you could say something on
yeah,
this.
no, thank you very much. Very interesting. So I didn't take the. I was thinking of Moretti's curves when I put the genre there, because. But you're right. I mean, that's the subgenre. Actually, I should have thought about that, because the novel, and it's interesting. The starting point. He was very much attacked for what he said about the circulation of the genre of the novel. That it started in England and maybe a little in France, and then went all over and was appropriated with local materials. I would disagree with the idea that it's only local materials, because it's also mixed with forms, local forms. You can see in Amadou Kourouma that he uses, for instance, the traditional narratives, the conte tales, and mixes it with the novel. But you're totally right that you can see that through the global market, the genre of the novel became a global genre and circulated. And this is the argument where he is right. This argument would not be right for poetry, which existed before. And so you're right, and thank you, because I did this table yesterday night, and so it needs to be affiné, as we say. And of course, a genre could be at different levels studied, and also the strategies of mixing genre by authors could be at the level of micro, and strategies could be studied at so I think it's objects, and also a mix of methodologies and object building the object. There is no ontology.
Last question, yeah.
All right, thank you so much. I had so many questions about the details, about people making literature and making cheese, but I think I want to ask a big question about the global scale. And it's actually your question: what's a world author, and who makes the world author? So one kind of counterintuitive implication of the global scale, right? It's actually smaller than the scales below, right? And in the sense that it's populated by very few authors. The global scale, the global literary field is actually much smaller than the scales below, and it seems that the intermediaries making the global authors are fewer still, right? And of course you've thought about and written about the relationship between globalization on the one hand and the diversification of that global on the other hand. And so, right, so is globalization, the process of globalization, really just a process of concentration in effect? Can there be something like a diversified global field without kind of becoming something particular again? I would be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question. Of course, I cannot answer that in 1 minute, but I still will try to give some ideas. So you're totally right. There are whole areas like African languages where there are publications that circulate, but we have no idea of them, because these are not the ones who get translated. Those who get translated are those who write in French or English and publish with French there is all this vernacularization trend now to study this. The same thing happens in India, so there is a rich literature, but at the same time there are attempts to break these borders. There was a Hindi author who was rewarded the Booker Prize recently, and this might be an indication toward change and opening to these languages. The denationalization also went with this. You know, when the Catalonia was invited to the Frankfurt Book Fair, it made a big scandal. But so the issue of the regional languages is one. But at the same time, you are totally right that at the meso level, we have much more going on there. But yeah, so I wouldn't say that the global is more universal than the meso. I have no idea because I cannot read these languages, so I don't know what is there. And I don't have a kind of normative statement about the universal. And also we can see that the criteria is to be. I didn't bring quotations, but for Kawabata is that he brought the Japanese soul. This idea, the essentialist approach to literature as both being universal but particular. So this tension is always there. The tension is always there, but what Casanova showed, and I think she's totally right, is that the chance to be recognized as universal is unevenly distributed, and it's not related to the actual work, it's related of the power relation who decide what universal is. And so the role of these intermediaries was crucial in doing that because they had the power relation. And this might change now with the fact that those big conglomerates, they are not so much interested anymore with literature. They can find other ways to make money, and so the symbolic capital accumulation on the long run. I didn't develop, but of course financial capitalism breaks the temporality of the older capitalism that was building on accumulation, because you just sell and then you don't care about what is in how do you say in English, le fond? I just forgot the backlist. The backlist.
The backlist.
The backlist. So yeah, you don't care. You just sell. It's a start of an answer.
Yeah, great. So thank you so much for this account of the different scales of world literature. And I think there's also a project on universalism looming somewhere in the background. So is universalism something that's really still speaks to us, or is it something that we will sooner or later leave behind? And we're very happy to keep on discussing with you these very interesting topics and questions. Thank you so much, Gisèle.
Thank you very much.